I wanted to talk to you a bit about forest management in British Columbia and specific topics related to the type of forest management that is required for BC. And I think that questions around forest management in BC are going to be interesting for you, because for me it was very revealing that when I came to BC, things seem to be very different to what they are in Europe. So I'll start off with a brief comparison between the two countries, so you get an idea of the scope. Then I'll talk about the BC forests and the forest economy in a quick overview. And then I'll go into forest ownership and management in BC, which is quite interesting because it basically sets the stage for the legislation of forest management in BC. And in the end, I will talk about a piece of work that I have spent some time on with my colleagues recently, which looks into current challenges and problems with forest management in BC and a couple of approaches on how to deal with them. So first of all, you see here a Mercator projection of the Earth, and in purple we have Spain, and then in light blue Canada. And you see Canada is quite large. So the total area of the country is about 990 million hectares, about 20 times the size of Spain. And we do have 350 million hectares of forest lands in the country. The interesting part is that despite this enormous size of the country, there are not that many people there, right? And this shows in the population. So you see that despite the size, actually there are less people in Canada than in Spain. And this makes up about 92 people per square kilometer in Spain. I think in Germany it's 200, and then 4 in Canada. So that means that not only it can be quite lonely sometimes, but also that in some places there's not a lot of infrastructure like roads, etc., because simply nobody ever went there and carried out forestry there, right? So I also want to look at BC, because I think comparing Spain with Canada does not tell the full story, because Canada is divided into provinces and territories that are organized basically very similar to how countries would be organized in Europe. We do have a federal legislation, but when it comes to forest management, basically the provinces are in charge of creating legislation and law around forestry. So you see British Columbia here in the far west of the country, and then you see in the north we have Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, which are territories that have a lot less forests than the more southern provinces. And when it comes to the population, the majority of the population is actually clustered at the southern border with the US. And then the farther north you go, the fewer people you'll find. But going back to sizes, so you see that BC then only is about double the size of Canada, and it has about 57 million hectares of forests. And the population is a bit higher than if you look at all of Canada, which is because some of those territories up in the north are very much less populated than those in the provinces in the south. All right, so that gives you a bit of an idea about the scope and yeah, what we're dealing with. The forests in BC are made up of 90% softwood species. Softwood species are the most interesting for the forest economy, so for producing saw, lumber, etc. And I listed a couple of species here. At the coast in BC, one of the most valuable species is actually western red cedar, Thuja plicata. And I have an interesting project going on looking into how we can regenerate western red cedar, despite the fact that deer also like them very much. I think it is a problem that you experience in Spain as well. And we are currently working with the ministry that has established a breeding program for western red cedar trees that are higher in monoterpene content in the needles. So they smell very intensively, and deer don't like that so much. So basically we can plant those trees with higher monoterpene content in the needles, and hopefully the deer will not really want to browse on them. But whether or not that's really going to work out, we're currently finding out in a project that we have established in one of our 2 research forests. So the Faculty of Forestry also manages 2 large research forests, one of them close to Vancouver in Maple Ridge, and there we have now about 10 hectares replanted with those marker-assisted bred seedlings, and we will find out whether or not we can enhance regeneration without the danger of the trees being browsed. So here you see a couple of seedlings of those species, which is what we use for planting after a harvest operation. But I'll talk about this a bit more later. So going back to the BC forest economy, I brought a couple of numbers that show you how important forestry in BC really is. I've spoken with my colleagues in Europe about this a lot, that sometimes it can be a bit frustrating when you do forest economics in Germany, for example. Basically, you're optimizing decimals, things behind the comma, right? And it's very different in BC, because forestry really is the one of the major backbones of the province's economy. And you see that, for example, generally, annually, we had about $860 million of public revenue generated through forestry that supports healthcare, education, and infrastructure. So this money comes into the budget from companies that carry out forest management, for example, and cut trees, etc., and pay their fees to the government or to the crown. And overall, we have about 60,000 people employed in forestry in the province, with 12,000 people employed in the value-added sector. So basically, this would be downstream jobs, and this would be value-added, like producing things like furniture, etc. Overall, it's a much smaller number than this here in the primary industry, if you like, and the reason is that we sell over 90% of our forest products, which is shown in this number here, to overseas buyers, with the majority of the products being sold to China and the US. And overall, as you may have heard, currently there are negotiations happening around NAFTA, which is a trade agreement between the US and Canada. We also have a softwood lumber agreement, which basically organizes the trade of lumber between the US and Canada. And with the new administration in the US, these things are being renegotiated. So maybe those largest purchases are going to change in the future, and maybe there will be more value-added products coming straight from BC rather than selling raw material. I think that would be good, because then we would have more jobs in the province as well. But it's not for us to tell. We will just wait and see. All right, so you see, forestry is really very important in BC. So I think total forest exports worth $14 billion worth of trade value in 2016. Now about the forest ownership. I've mentioned that there is a lot of money, about $860 million per year, coming into the budget from people who carry out forestry in BC. And the reason for that is that about 95% of the forests in BC are actually crown land, so they are publicly owned, and only 5% are private land. And whoever carries out forest operations on crown land does so under a license, for example, a volume-based license, and does pay a stumpage for the timber they harvest from the land. So there's a direct cash flow, if you like, into the budgets. Overall, you see that public forest lands that are subject to forest management agreements, such as volume-based licenses, etc., are only 22 million hectares. And remember that I showed on this initial slide that overall forestry or forests in BC make up about 60 million hectares. And the reason for this number being so much smaller is that a large amount of forest lands are special management zones or parks, etc., protected areas, national parks, and are set aside for other uses than timber production. So, for example, recreation or wildlife protection, etc. We've recently had a change in our legislation, I guess pretty much like what is happening in Spain today, right? And we have a new minister of FLNRO, which is the ministry that is also in charge of forestry. FLNRO is the abbreviation for forest lands and natural resource operations, but I think recently they also added rural development. So even though we continue to use the short acronym, we also now have rural development. It hasn't yet made it into the acronym, but you know, we have to know that it's there. And our minister in charge is Honorable Doug Donaldson, and he, with his deputy minister Tim Sheldon, is responsible for administrating BC's forests and other natural resources. Now, you can imagine that the administration of an area so large requires a very detailed knowledge of the subject of forestry. And given the fact that we do not only have forests in this ministry, but also lands, natural resource operations, and rural development, which includes things like agriculture or grazing rights, we need a forest specialist to really help with decision making in this case. And that is where the chief forester comes into play. The chief forester of British Columbia is Diane Nichols. She is a forester that started training on the ground, basically I think she even has a degree from UBC, but I'm not quite sure. So she obtained a degree in forestry and then really started working her way through the ranks in her career until she now made it to this very prestigious position of chief forester in BC. And she provides key strategic guidance to the ministry when it comes to forest stewardship and decisions about forest management. and that is probably the most important part of her job, she determines timber harvest levels. So she's basically the one who says how much people can harvest where and when. And this is done with the so-called allowable annual cut, which is determined for each timber supply area. So we call those areas timber supply areas or TSA. And she does this about every 5 to 10 years for each TSA. And I think we have 38 timber supply areas plus a few tree farm licenses that operate under a similar approach. And she uses a 200-year projection of timber supply to make her decision. And this projection is very similar to some of the work that is being done at this university as well as in Munich and BC, where we basically develop a decision support system that we feed with information about what we have on the land base, and then try and project into the future how this current situation will develop over time, and where we will be able to harvest timber, where we will have to maybe set aside some areas to protect specific species, etc. But I will talk about this a bit more later when it comes to decision support systems. So the AAC determination is a combination of the condition of existing forests, which I've basically, similar to what I've just said, then the growth rate of the existing and harvested forest, how the forest is managed, and choices around the rate of harvest. And the way it is done is basically that we might have a map of the land base, and I'll add a little river here so it looks more like an actual land base rather than just a blob, I guess. And then we use a spatially explicit software like ArcGIS, etc., to determine polygons on the land base that have homogeneous conditions. So we might have an area with one specific species being dominant in all polygons that are numbered 1. We might have a different type of forest in all the polygons being numbered 2, and so on. And maybe we have some areas that have to be set aside for protection, which could be those with lines in them. Now, to each of those polygons, we assign information regarding growth and yield. So, for example, for all the forests in polygon type 1, we would have a specific growth and yield curve with volume over time that shows us how the trees in all these areas develop. And we develop a base case scenario that shows the status quo. So for this polygon, we might also know that all the forests in this area are 50 years old today. So we might already be somewhere here on our growth and yield curve. Now we start the projection, and the software knows that this type of forest has a rotation age of, let's say, 80 years. Oops. I'll put R for rotation time. Then in the information over the 200-year time frame, it would pull out the amount of timber that will be harvested from this polygon in 30 years from now. So the difference between the current age and the rotation age. And it would basically put it in its memory and then replant this polygon with a select species. So that is another thing that we can do. We can tell the software, once you harvested a forest type 1, and it might have been, let's say, a lodgepole pine before, I want you to replant it with a western red cedar stand, so it will have to move from this growth and yield curve to this growth and yield curve, which might look something like this. And then following the projection after year 80, it will basically look at this growth and yield curve. And there are literally no limits to what you can put into the software. So you can put in buffers around streams and rivers. You can put in green up age, which would be a limitation of which polygons you can cut based on whether or not the adjacent polygon has recently been cut. So for example, if I put up a green up restriction, and I have just cut this polygon, then even though this one might be ready for harvest when it comes to the rotation time, I would only be allowed to cut it once this stand is at least 20 years old again, so you don't accidentally, so to say, cut everything at once in the software. And now, yes, please.
Considering that every polygon is going to be cut by tree cutting and replanting, or
yes, yes. So. Exactly. So the question was whether or not the software would assume that we clear cut when we harvest, and clear cutting is the main approach in BC, much to my dismay, because I think that we can do things, we can do very good things with other approaches, patch cuts, etc., selective logging, and the software can model other approaches. And it is done, for example, in areas where we have multiple usages. So, for example, wildlife retention and timber production. For companies, often the most important factor are economics. And one aspect that is very different in BC than it is in most of Europe is that, for example, if you get a license to cut somewhere in the province, you would also be in charge of building the roads to get there. And that can be a major cost. So people have to build a road, and every meter of that road costs a specific amount of money. And if they then get to where they can harvest, and the amount of timber that they can take from this area does not allow them to finance the operational costs they had, it's basically not worth it. So often patch cuts do not really allow to make ends meet, or other cuts. But I think actually with slight adjustments, they will become more popular, and we are on a good trajectory towards that because of some challenges that the province has experienced in recent years with, for example, large-scale insect infestations, etc. And then we do have species that require protection, like woodland caribou. And yeah, so you can really see how things are changing. And I assume that in the long term, we are most likely going to move away from the pure clear-cut approach some more. Yes, please.
How do you apply green up constraints?
So,
the scale or the protection?
in the software, you mean? So in the software, basically, we model in 10-year or 5-year steps, right? So for each of the polygons, we would know its state in each 5-year step. So year 0, year 5, year 10, etc. So basically, once it was harvested, it would be locked, and you couldn't harvest it until 20 years after. And then the constraints would be lifted, and the software could cut it again. All right. So,
these polygons?
Oh, it's very different. So sometimes they can be quite large, sometimes they can be quite small, and it depends on the homogeneity, right? So if you imagine you are taking a bird's eye view of a landscape, then basically you would try and set aside areas that have very similar characteristics. And whenever you find an area with very similar characteristics, you draw a line around it. And maybe sometimes it's huge, sometimes it's small. And it depends a bit on where you are in BC as well. So we have maybe higher diversity in the coastal areas, whilst in the interior it is less diverse. So bigger polygons in the interior and smaller ones on the coast.
One more question.
Yes, please.
I just wanted to know, you said before that this software was used by Germany as well, in Germany as well?
A similar software, so not this specific software, but a decision support system that supports strategic management decisions in forestry, yes.
But they have the same forestry management?
No, it's very different. But the general approach or idea on how to model something over a long time frame is very similar. So you could basically take this idea and apply it to Spanish conditions as well. Yeah.
This software called Woodstock, or it's on the go already?
So Woodstock is one of the commercial software solutions developed by a company called Remsoft. And it's a Canadian company that does sell the product to whoever wants to use it, so to say, right? So it's very popular in Canada, but even more so in the US. So big companies like Weyerhaeuser, they use it. And it is very powerful because it has an optimization module. So it can mathematically determine what the best approach would be to, let's say, maximize one specific objective. So if your objective is maximize timber production, you can ask the software, what do I have to do where and when to maximize my timber production under the given constraints? However, Woodstock is outperformed by another software that is called Patchworks, which is developed by a Canadian company called Spatial. When it comes to including additional objectives such as fire management, etc. And we do have a third software product that we use, which is called FPS Atlas, Forest Planning Studio Atlas, which is the, I would say, most simplistic of the three. But it is very good if you want to use it and learn how to develop a model for a specific forest area. It is basically a push-button type of software. So once you have your data set developed, you can feed it into the software, and there are buttons that allow you to insert green up age, etc. Whilst for the other softwares, you have to enter some of what you want the software to do by writing a bit of code. And this software, because it was developed at UBC, is available for download for free if you're interested in looking at it. And a previous postdoc of mine has written a substantial guide on how you actually develop this data set that has all the information about your land base to then feed it into FPS Atlas. So if you're interested in this, you can go onto my lab website and download the software from there, and then come to UBC and do a postdoc with me. All right. So this is a map of the 38 timber supply areas that British Columbia is divided into. It's a bit tiny, but For orientation, you see this is Vancouver Island again, and down here is Vancouver. This is the border to the US. And we have, maybe you can see it, brown lines that depict the timber supply areas. And then we have red areas that are tree farm licenses, which also operate under a specific license. But the area that is operated under a tree farm license and is inside a timber supply area doesn't count towards the area used for this timber supply area. So every couple of years, the chief forester has to look at each of those timber supply areas again and determine the maximum timber to be cut from them. And once she's done that, she also has the opportunity or the option to apportion the volume. So there is a lump volume available from the area, and then she can decide, let's say 50% go to volume-based licenses, 50% or this and that many percent can only be harvested from a specific area over here, 20% have to be harvested in stands that are that have a specific leading species, etc. So she can direct some more. And when it comes to those licenses, these two forms of licenses basically make all the difference. So we have volume-based licenses and area-based licenses. Now, if you are a forest company and you have a volume-based license, you can basically go anywhere in the area that the chief forester allows you to go to and harvest that volume. So you can imagine that a lot of emphasis is on economics, right? So you will want to try and go to the areas with the best quality timber that you may only have to build very few kilometers of roads to get into, etc. And after you've harvested, you have the obligation to replant. And when it comes to replanting, you have a choice what you can do based on specific guides. But oftentimes the focus again is on economics. So you wouldn't, like a forest owner who is replanting his or her personal forest, necessarily look into what your kids will be able to harvest or your grandchildren in the future, but you will look at how can I reforest this area with the least costs, right? I'm not saying that everyone does this. There are companies that do a very good job, and they're very proud of the work they're doing when it comes to silviculture. But the economics are very important, specifically given the fact that the win margins in forestry can be quite narrow. So it's an industry where we have to really make sure that we make ends meet, so to say. All right, so I want to give you a little example, actually it's two examples, about how this AAC determination can look like. And here is a screenshot from the government website where the government basically shares all the information about a brand new determination of AAC. So this is for the Arrowsmith timber supply area, which is in the south of Vancouver Island. And it was renewed in February of this year. And something that is really very nice about how forests are managed in BC is that all the information is publicly available. So you can go to the government website and download all the information about how they determined AAC, what the considerations were that went into making specific decisions, what the changes are and why, and you can try and understand why, I guess, an AAC ended up being what it is. And you see here that basically with this new determination of AAC, the Arrowsmith timber supply area gets a slight reduction in allowable cut. And the slight reduction is actually 10% from previous cut levels. So if you can imagine that if you are a company operating in the area and you're hoping to get your volume-based licenses renewed, and the new AAC determination is 10% below what it was before, it might be a bit scary, right? Because that might mean that you get 10% less raw material to harvest. However, in this specific case, the reduction is due to a transfer of treaty settlement lands to a First Nations community. So basically a First Nations community that probably has operated on the land before now gets this land like a private owner. So they'll be in charge of how it's managed from now on. So basically the overall size of the timber supply area and the timber harvest land base in this TSA was reduced by this area. And then also a First Nations woodland license was developed. So that is another chunk that is basically cut out and now managed by someone else. And a community forest was created. And community forests are area-based licenses. So it's one license type agreement that communities can apply for. So for example, if you all live in a small community and you have beautiful forest around it, and you decide you want to manage this forest as a community forest, you can apply for such a license, and then you get an area-based license which puts you in charge of managing this forest. These community forests are actually much more similar to forests that are managed in Europe than those areas that operate under volume-based licenses, because communities often focus on different objectives than timber licensees that are industrial might, right? So they might be interested in creating mountain bike trails, in visual quality objectives, so it does look nice from the community, etc. And it is a great opportunity to also showcase some of the potential that alternative approaches to clear cuts do have, like you suggested earlier.
Sorry, one question.
Yes.
And when it's managed by First Nations, how is it?
So basically, they are in charge when they have a treaty, so to say, and they manage it like a private landowner.
And
They,
the revenues, do they share the revenues with the...
no, so the revenues all belong to whoever holds the license, and depending on the license type, you might have to pay a stumpage. So in community forests, for example, you have to pay a specific dollar value, so to say, per cubic meter that you harvest. And in cases where you operate under volume-based licenses, these might be higher than when you operate under community-based license. So they determine stumpage based on license type, etc. And all this information can be found on the government website as well. So you will always have to pay a little fraction, even though I'm not entirely sure, but I believe that if we're talking about treaty lands, there will be no stumpage to be paid.
Sorry?
So treaty lands, indigenous communities that now become effectively the private landowner don't have to pay stumpage, I think. I'm pretty sure they don't have to pay stumpage, but I would have to double check. There is another license that is called First Nations Woodland License, which is basically similar to a community license, and here the licensee would have to pay a stumpage.
And do they have any kind of training, something like that? Or they have to...
Yeah. Often they hire someone and then, as a contingency plan, so to say, train people in forestry to become professional foresters, because there is a requirement of hiring a professional forester who can sign off on management plans. So only a member of the Association of British Columbia Forest Professionals, the ABCFP, is allowed to really sign off on management plans. And so one person, so to say, per company would be required who has that designation. And actually, the question is quite an important one, because forestry has the unique potential to bring jobs to rural areas, right? So forestry as a profession is actually quite interesting for indigenous communities and people that live in resource-based communities in general. So the interest in getting training in forestry is quite high. And you can not only get a university degree, but you can also get a degree, for example, from an Institute of Technology, which would allow you to work in forestry. And often these institutes are already located in more rural areas, so it's a degree that is quite attractive to someone who wants to go back and work in a rural environment. Yeah. All right, so besides the fact that the overall AAC was reduced by about 10%, you can see that it was basically because areas are still managed, but are now managed under different license types. And additionally to this, these decisions that lead to the actual volume, the volume was geographically partitioned. So basically a maximum of 50,000 cubic meter now have to be harvested from the eastern portion of the TSA, so on the eastern end of the island, and then a maximum of 6.8 thousand cubic meter from Claggett Sound, and so on. So this is what the chief forester can do when it comes to directing where people should actually focus their operations at. Now, a very different example is the Canal timber supply area. Canal is located in the interior, so about here, versus Arrowsmith was located here, so many kilometers to the north, so to say. And Canal is one of the TSAs that was heavily hit by the mountain pine beetle infestation that BC experienced. Mountain pine beetle is very similar to the European type bark beetles that are causing lots of damage on spruce and other trees. And what happened was that basically so much timber got damaged that the chief forester increased allowable annual cut to allow companies to salvage log some of that timber. So she basically, or back then her predecessor, basically determined higher levels so companies could go in and get that timber as long as it was still good, right? So basically go all you can get before it falls apart and loses value. Here you see a picture of Manning Provincial Park, which is located in Quesnel TSA, and you see all those dead pine trees, very similar to National Park Bayerischer Wald, where they decided to just let the spruce bark beetle go and see what nature will do on its own. And turns out nature didn't do much, but just let all the trees die. So for the economy, this is a very serious situation. And this graph here shows basically the extent of the infestation. And yeah, so we hope that the worst is over, so to say, and we can go back to normal, which is reflected in these cut levels here. You'll see that now the cut level is about 35% below that determined in 2011. And yes, the cut level was increased to deal with this situation, but the problem remains that companies have made the required adjustments to deal with those higher levels. And now they basically have to go back to a lower level, which can be a challenge. They might have hired people, they might have purchased additional tools that they need or vehicles, etc. So yeah, it's a challenging time. But even worse than that is the fact that the midterm timber supply shortage is basically looming over BC, which is also caused by those beetles. And what it is that now that we have increased those harvest levels to deal with the infested trees, we have cut trees that might not have been available for harvest if everything would have gone according to plan. And I don't know, are you familiar with the concept of a normal forest? Yes, perfect. So if you have a normal forest, which you hardly ever have in reality, but let's imagine you do, you have age classes on the y-axis and then maybe hectares or volume on the y-axis. So here you have age classes, 1, 2, etc. They might all be like 20 years. So all the trees 0 to 19 years, then all the trees 20 to 39 and so on. And ideally it would be evenly distributed. And every decade or every 20 years you would basically harvest this entire area and replant it so it would go back over here. So you would harvest the oldest and then it would go into the youngest age class. However, now that we have cut trees that were too young, we are basically looking at something like a dip. And these trees will age, and it means that all of a sudden we will not have enough timber available to really harvest at the time when they should reach rotation. So there are all kinds of considerations going into this and going into how we can deal with the situation. And I wanted to talk to you a bit about this work that I've done with my colleagues, which is looking into some of those challenges. And I think I'm gonna just very briefly talk about this and jump straight to how we hope we can provide a few steps towards closing the problem with the midterm timber supply shortage. Because when I look at the time, I think we've already spoken for 40 minutes, so I want to get to what I find most interesting here. So here you, by the way, see actually patch cuts that are supposed to mimic natural disturbances. So with my colleagues Steve Mitchen, Harry Nelson, Bruce Larson, Suzanne Simard, Deb DeLong, Judah Melton, and others, we worked on a white paper regarding current challenges in BC that we then submitted to the ministry. And what we did was we spoke to practitioners and we reviewed the Forest Practices Board reports. The Forest Practices Board is like an independent organization that looks into whether or not forest management has actually been carried out as desired, and if not, companies basically get suggestions on how they can improve their work. We have looked into a database that we have in BC where companies upload information about the work that they've done on the land base, etc. And we've discussed these 5 questions with our practitioners. So, for example, what changes in regeneration and stand tending practices are needed to promote resilient and valuable forests, etc. And basically, I would say 3 most important messages that we got from the practitioners are that there is not really enough guidance regarding what the landscape level objectives are besides timber production. So I mentioned that we have been doing kind of this type of approach or using decision support systems in the past to determine timber. And when forestry started in BC, the resource was so vast that other objectives were not really top priority, let's put it like this. And this is changing, not only because of the midterm timber supply shortage, but also because people simply want to see something else in those objectives that the government sets, like wildlife management or visual quality. And these desires, so to say, are not yet reflected in the legislation. So, as mentioned before, if you as a company harvest timber, your only obligation is to reforest the stand, and then you are in charge of the stand until it has reached what is called free-to-grow status. So basically, a status where the structure of this new forest is promising, and you think you can just let it grow until it reaches rotation, and you don't have to do anything until you return maybe 60, 80 years later. However, it turns out that we might have to come back to those forests in between and make sure that we actually get what we want. And specifically when it comes to landscape level objectives, we need to be able to kind of steer things in between this long time frame. So it's not enough to just determine this free-to-grow status and then just walk away, but you have to come back. And ideally you come back with some clear objectives regarding what else do we need. Yes, we do need timber production, but we also need carbon sequestration, clean water, visual quality objectives, wildlife management, etc. And we are looking, and I'm quickly jumping over to, yes?
Just a little bit about other silvicultural policies, just some measures or something to apply in order to improve conservation, like, I don't know, modifying rotation or...
You mean if something like this exists?
Yeah.
So we do have forest stewardship plans that have to be developed for areas in which management is carried out, and they do consider 11 objectives that include all those things. However, all those objectives ideally would be linked with criteria and indicators, so we can track over time whether or not we really reach our goal, right? So we might say, okay, we want to manage for water quality, but then how do we do that, right? And then how do we trace that we actually reach our objectives 125 years from now? So we could develop criteria and indicators. So we could say, I want to manage for water quality, and I think to make sure that we get good water, we need a specific forest structure, etc. And then we decide this is the indicator, and every 10 years, let's say, we look at whether or not the forest structure actually is like we think it should be, to make sure that we keep our water clean. And here,
Guidelines.
exactly, and there is room for improvement regarding clearly determining those objectives and the related criteria and indicators. And I think,
Could you adjust it while you're doing it? Like
yes, yes.
it,
Absolutely, yeah, and I think it is even necessary, right? So you might start your work on a specific assumption, but let's say we run this model and all of a sudden something happens that we have not accounted for, wildfire, for example, and half of it burns down. Then we have to run it again to make sure we are still on the right trajectory towards what we really want. Okay, so I brought more detail about each of those objectives, but I want to jump to the work that we're doing in my lab. So I've already mentioned that we do have these 2 research forests, etc. And overall in Vancouver we have 50,000, a bit over 50,000 students. Obviously not all of them are in forestry. Maybe that'll change in the future, I don't know. But all these people are really intensively working towards finding solutions for those challenges. And one possible solution would be to try to implement commercial thinning, specifically when it comes to the midterm timber supply shortage. And we are now trying to collect enough information to be able to feed our decision support systems with data that allows us to assess whether or not commercial thinnings might be economically and ecologically viable. And it is interesting, very interesting to me, because from the viewpoint of a European forester, I would immediately say, oh yes, absolutely, you know, pre-commercial thinnings, commercial thinnings, going into your stands more frequently, you can increase the quality, you can make sure that you get the product you want. But because of the legislation and the whole setup of BC forestry, it is a bit different. And not everyone might be excited about having to commercially thin. Imagine you have to build the roads, you have to buy new tools because you only have, let's say, 2 very specific harvesters, or you might not employ hand fellers, then you have to change lots of things. And we looked into whether or not commercial thinnings might be a solution using Bulkley timber supply area. Now Bulkley is located about here, earlier Arrowsmith is about here, and Canal about here, so even farther north and a bit to the west. We have Bulkley TSA, and we chose this timber supply area for the study because it is typical for an interior timber supply area that got heavily damaged by the mountain pine beetle, now facing a midterm timber supply shortage. And we developed a decision support system for the TSA very similar to that used by the chief forester to determine AAC. And here you see the current age class distribution in this TSA. So once again, you have volume on the y-axis and then the age on the x-axis. And in orange is shown the non-timber harvest land base, so all that is forest but cannot really be harvested, so parks and areas set aside for other purposes. And in blue, you see what is available for harvest. And you see here we have kind of a drop, right? So if this would ideally be a normal forest type situation where all the age classes are equally filled with volume, we are not very close, let's put it like this. So we looked into 6 alternative methods, so a 2-pass commercial thinning system, and then setting a minimum harvest age using the culmination of mean annual increment, and that would be where the annual increment, so to say, culminates, and that would lead to the economically ideal rotation time, or using a minimum of 150 cubic meters per hectare volume available in each polygon to harvest. And we modeled those scenarios, and you see on these 6 graphs the age class distribution, as it turns out, after we ran the model for 200 years. And this is what the situation would look like if we would continue business as usual, right? So you see literally nothing left in those age classes that is not non-timber harvest land-based. And here you see that each of those age classes is 20 years. So 20, 40, 60, 80, 90 years, no timber available for harvest is not an option, right? So overall, lots of assumptions have gone into this model, and you have lots of buttons to push and kind of screws to turn to get to those results. But the very important message is that here we have tried to include economic considerations. So, for example, you see that we said to the model, you can you can commercially thin, but only in those polygons that are not farther than 300 meters away from already existing roads, right? So basically, a licensee could go in, commercially thin, without having to pay huge amounts of money for constructing a road, but the possibility of using what is already there. Or we have said that we need a minimum volume, so there'll be enough revenue from a commercial thinning to really make up for possible costs. And it turns out that yes, it is possible, but lots of answers remain to be given, and those are mainly about how things or how forests will react once we really do this. So the model that is based on lots of assumptions says yes, you can do it, but we do have very little information, for example, about the growth of the residual stand, right? How will the stand grow after we've gone in? What could be a problem with diseases? And you probably know Heterobasidion annosum, Hallimasch in German, a fungus that goes into the trees and causes rot. And it can find its way into a stand when you do commercially thin. So that's a problem. So we really have to think about where we thin and whether or not it would endanger the remaining stand. But I have written a newsletter article in a local production of the University of British Columbia. It's called Branch Lines. And I had a lot of responses from practitioners. So they called me or sent me emails and they said, we have tried this and it really works and now we want to learn more. Or they called me and said, but what about the diseases? So apparently it's a topic that is very interesting to practitioners out there, and I hope that we can learn a lot more about it, and also maybe lean somewhat on information that already exists from Europe, where commercial thinning is practiced quite frequently. And then last but not least, obviously, I want to show to you all those people that are actually doing the hard work, that are quite behind this. This is my lab group, and they're working energetically towards those solutions. And on this project, I've specifically worked with Jillian Spies and then a whole bunch of other people. And maybe some of you know Valentine. She's just joined me as a postdoc. She's previously worked in Switzerland with Harald Buchmann. All right, so I guess time for your questions. Yes, please. I'm coming down here.
About the companies that are doing the clear cuts when those big stands had this disease or this beetle.
Yes.
How do they use the wood? Because I think it's not worth it anymore.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it depends on how long you wait before you harvest it. So if it has just died or it is about to die, it'll be still fine. But if you wait 5 years, 10 years, exactly that is the case. It won't be worth anything anymore.
Is it allowed to sell to export it or it's not?
Yeah, that depends, right? So basically transport of timber from Alberta to BC is what we think brought the beetle to BC in the first place. So it is there are problems and you have to deal with it accordingly. In BC, lots of timber is actually transported using waterways. So it is shipped on large ships from an international harbor like Vancouver, and it is floated down the rivers, for example. And in this process...
Previously?
No.
Okay.
But it's definitely something that has to be considered to avoid problems. And I have another project that looks into forest invasive alien species and how to choose mitigation approaches. Because if there would be an invasive species found on BC timber that we plan to export to China or the US, our biggest markets, it could lead to an export ban, and that would be a major problem. So basically, if we as a country cannot prove that we do everything we can to avoid things like that, and something happens, the countries that normally buy timber from us would say, no more Canadian timber or no more BC timber, and we would not be able to sell it, right? So it's very important, and these are questions that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is dealing with. One of our partners on this large project, which is called BioSafe. If you want to learn a bit about it, you can go to the lab website and have a look at what it is we do.
Thank you.
Perfect. All right.
Another question?
Yes, please.
Sorry. I'm very curious. You said that the ministry is not just for forest, it's also for the natural resources.
Yes.
Is mining included?
Yes.
So how is it?
Hang on, is that correct?
I mean,
There might be
any overlapping interests?
Yes, so I'm not entirely sure whether or not there might be an extra ministry for mining. It might be the case, but what definitely is the case is, yes, there are overlapping rights. So for example, in the Yukon, we have a lot of mining going on. And often the mining companies have subsurface rights, so they have the rights to take everything underneath the soil, and others might have the rights to everything above surface. For example, an indigenous community. And now you can imagine that there are tensions around whose right has to be considered first. So a mining company might have subsurface rights, but they might go in and destroy the forest to get to whatever is underneath the soil, right? So oftentimes there are agreements between the two licensees about, for example, if you go there and have to cut down all the trees, let us do it, let us come first, let us harvest the forest, and then you can do whatever you want with the subsurface resources. Yeah. Good, perfect. Well, thank you very much for listening.
Question. Thanks a lot for your brilliant presentation. And 3 or 4 years ago, Lars stayed here, and he told us that carbon sequestration maybe was a challenge in British Columbia. It is very important in the forest management, or like another objective?
So that's a good question, because the ministry has made very bold promises regarding how much carbon they will sequester, and the majority of this sequestration is supposed to come from forestry, right? And now, the moment you start looking at the emissions that forestry causes as well, it is not an easy calculation to make. It's quite challenging. And we are working with the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, with Werner Kurz, maybe you've heard his name, on finding management approaches that would allow more carbon to be sequestered, and for this equation to actually work out, so to say. And things that are considered are, for example, approaching the management of old growth forests differently, or only working in specific type forests, changing regeneration practices, etc. And something else that is very important for this equation is what will happen to the timber, right? So if you use it for pellet production or bioenergy production, you basically burn it and you release the carbon again. But if you construct a house with it, it's going to be stored there for some time. So it is quite complex, and I agree, it is not as straightforward as one would think, right? So okay, let's just reforest and we'll be fine. No, Yeah. We're working on making sure that the ministry can keep their promises.
Douglas fir are all primary forest or plantation?
We have both. So Douglas fir is often planted, yeah.
And I saw in other countries is species very invasive. In Canada is very invasive.
Douglas fir? It is native to the region, so it grows well. Invasive, I would not necessarily.
I saw in the South Island of New Zealand, they have a lot of problems with Douglas fir.
Okay. Yeah, no. So the reason might be that we don't often use natural regeneration, right? So even if it's there, it could be outperformed by other things, even though, at least on the coast, Douglas fir would be a desired species. So if it would come on its own, I think we would like that, yeah. Sure, and you had another one.
And I would like to know if there is any kind of wood certification.
Yes, so absolutely. So Canada, and specifically BC, has the largest area of forests worldwide that is certified. So FSC does play a role.
COC or just forest management?
Oh, for forest management, I think it's both, but we mainly focus on the certification of the timber and forest management. And PEFC plays a big role, and then I would say the most important one is SFI. It is a North American certificate.
PFC is European.
Yes, PFC is European and FSC is global, but SFI is, I think it is a Sustainable Forestry Initiative, and it is North American. Yeah.
And the standards, are they low, high, comparing with FSC, for example?
I wouldn't be able to tell. I would have to look into that in more detail, but I think they might be relatively similar. So often what drives the decision making is whether or not the certificate is known to the buyer and whether or not the costs of getting the timber certified are relatively equal, so to say, right? So if FSC would be a lot more expensive than SFI and customers purchasing the timber would value both certificates equal, then the companies would try and get SFI certified. All right, good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.